The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 40. Making It Better. The day after the break-in of Snape's office, the Carrows did indeed step up patrols in the corridors at night. Word had gotten out that the headmaster's office had been breached, so the Carrows had begun posting members of their own enforcement brigade outside of important offices, including McGonagall's. The enforcement brigade made Umbridge's inquisitorial squad look like a group of brownie guides working towards their jobs badges. Led by Vincent Crabbe, the enforcement brigade was known to hex first and ask questions later. Madame Pomfrey had taken on several seventh-year interns in the hospital wing to keep up with the enforcement brigade's victims. Hermione worried about how she would get in touch with Harry to let him know that they'd been unsuccessful. If McGonagall's flu was no longer an option, could she risk sending an owl? It wasn't until Draco commented about how he was surprised that Muggles survived without a flu network that she hit upon the solution. She enlisted the help of Thorn, who carried a note to her father. While she waited for a response, she perfected a modified bubblehead charm to allow it to encase objects. She was surprised when Thorn returned at midnight the next night carrying a small box. Inside of the box, wrapped carefully in a beautiful scarf, was a state-of-the-art mobile phone. The smooth silver and grey brick was as big around as a Mars bar, weighed twice as much as one, and fit perfectly in her palm. The note from her father explained that he'd sent the same one to Harry that day, and included the wizard's number. Hermione had to marvel at that. She thought it would take at least a week to get the mobiles. Dads really were resourceful sometimes. Hermione explained to Draco when it arrived. It occurred to me that wizarding enchantments would be looking for wizarding ways of communication. Flues, owls, perhaps even two-way mirrors or enchanted parchments. The extraordinary amounts of magic within Hogwarts would normally interfere with the signal, but by modifying the bubblehead to dampen the effects of magic in a highly localized area around the mobile phone, this works perfectly well to securely communicate with Harry. Right, Draco said, with a bit of uncertainty at this explanation. Draco regarded the device with a mixture of suspicion and jealousy, particularly when he learned that Hermione had gotten it to keep in touch with another wizard. However, his objections ended when she showed him the game Snake on the little device. Now, he didn't seem to mind having the mobile at all. Hermione chose Harry's number, helpfully already programmed into the contacts, along with Richard, Linda, and Narcissa. The wizard answered on the first ring. Hermione? Yes. How did you know it was me? She faltered in momentary confusion. Your dad put your number in my mobile. Blimey, I never thought I'd have a mobile phone all my own. Hermione smiled a bit sadly at this. Harry truly had grown up as an afterthought in his own home, having never really received a gift all his own. She explained briefly the outcome of the previous night's adventure. So, that's that, huh? No sword? Harry said dejectedly. Afraid not, Hermione said sympathetically. Snape refused to hand it over because he was afraid of it falling into the wrong hands. Such as his own, Harry bit out. Hermione bit her lip and plunged ahead. I read in Hogwarts history that the sword presents itself to a worthy Gryffindor in times of need or valor. Harry blew out a breath. Well, thanks for trying, anyway. I knew Snape would be no help, Harry said in disgust. After a few parting words, Hermione pressed the button to end the call and tossed the little Nokia back onto Draco's bed, where he snatched it up eagerly. You seem upset. Ask what we do next, Draco asked, pushing the little buttons to move the snake around the digital screen frantically, trying to eat the food. "I told him if we thought of anything, we'd let him know." Draco must have lost the snake game he was playing, because he looked up with a wry smile and tossed the mobile back onto the bed after a moment. "It was smart to tell him that you read that in that book. If he knew that it was what Snape told us, he'd likely try and storm the head's office himself tomorrow for it." Late autumn, 1997. In answer to the enforcement brigade, Dumbledore's army regrouped and began meeting often. Interest in them grew considerably, as did their numbers. Though most of the students at Hogwarts still avoided or overtly detested Hermione and Draco, others noticed how Neville and Ginny, now the de facto leaders of the Dumbledore's army, now treated them as friends. Hermione was no longer hexed behind her back, but nor was she welcomed back into the Gryffindor dormitories. For her part, Hermione formed her own secret group of sorts, though they dispensed with coming up with names, for once. Ginny and Neville at first met her and Draco in the remote stacks of the library. However, after a close encounter with Harper, a member of the enforcement brigade, they agreed to meet in Pansy and Hermione's room. Draco would sneak the two Gryffindors in with disillusionment charms. They would discuss defensive techniques, how to project shield charms to protect others around them, and how Harry, Ron, and their families were doing outside of Hogwarts. Hermione and Draco never divulged Harry's hunt for the Horcruxes, but they emphasized that Harry was actively working on a way to defeat the Dark Lord. This worked out well until a night in early December in which Pansy returned unexpectedly early from a date gone badly. "What's all this?" Pansy asked, caught off guard by the sudden intrusion of 3 additional people, including 2 Gryffindors. Hermione began, but her mind was blank. It was Draco who spoke up. "Pans, you know what this is. You'd best leave if you don't want to be involved in this. I know you prefer to stay neutral." Pansy looked at each of them carefully, appraisingly. Finally, she tossed her cloak onto her trunk and kicked off her tall black heels, settling onto her duvet with a slow smile. "I'll stay." Hermione looked startled. "You're sure?" Pansy huffed out a breath. "A long time ago, Draco told me the first time I tried to make conversation with you, to make it better. At the time, I thought he was just being his usual asshole self. But as I've thought more about it, I've come to realize that maybe I can do more to make it better." Everyone was quiet, waiting for her to say more. Pansy looked down at her hands on her lap, seemingly looking at something that wasn't there. She struggled to get her words out. "My father came home one day this past summer, with his hands covered in blood. He was shaking, not like he was afraid. It was more like he couldn't control his body. His eyes twitched. He was stuttering. Mother said it was the after effects of the Cruciatus curse." Ginny sucked in a breath. Neville listened with hardened stoicism. Hermione and Draco nodded sadly, having seen the effects themselves. Hermione wiped away a tear as it raced down her cheek. "Next morning he was in a better state, and I asked him about the blood. He said—" Here Pansy's voice went up an octave, and she paused to gather herself again. Then she continued, "He said he was on a mission to kill a Muggle-born, his half-blood wife, and their family, and that he hadn't wanted to go. He knew the man from years before. He was a good man, he said. But you know who has threatened my family in the past, and Father knew that this would be more of the same. So it was this other family, or our family. And Father knew that if he didn't go, someone else would." Fresh tears spilled from Pansy's eyes, and everyone waited with dread to hear the rest of her tale. "Father said all he could think about as he killed this family was that, at least for that night, we'd still be safe. But then—" She paused again, overcome by tears, and Neville reached into a pocket to withdraw a clean handkerchief. He held it out to her, but she couldn't see it through her tears. Neville came to sit on the bed next to Pansy. He gently lifted her chin, pressing the cool white cloth to her cheeks to absorb her tears. Pansy looked at him at first fearfully, but then with the most open, sincere look of wonder. Her tears were momentarily dry. "Go on," Neville said softly. There were several more seconds of silence before Pansy spoke again, oddly calmer now that she looked at Neville. "They went back to Malfoy Manor to report, but it turned out they'd missed the family's oldest daughter. She's 19, and she'd been out of the house that evening. She was a Ravenclaw, only a couple of years older than us. So, because they'd missed her, he and the others on his mission were punished anyway." Pansy drew in a deep breath, her bottom lip quivering uncontrollably. "Father told me that he hates himself, because all he could think about afterwards was that he wished he'd killed her too." Pansy looked away from all of them. It shamed her to admit this. When she turned her fierce gaze back on Neville, her dark eyes blazed. "I made Father tell me the name of the girl. I owed her some money with a note, telling her to flee before someone else came to finish the job. I don't know if she did. I hope so. But one thing I do know is this. I'm not going to sit around and wait for that asshole to come for me in the middle of the night. If there's a way to take this fight to him, we should do it." After taking a moment to get over her shock, Hermione spoke up. "That's wonderful, Pansy. Let me catch you up on what we're doing here. We've mainly been focusing on defensive spells, shield charms, disarming. That's all well and good, Granger, but the time for defensive magic has passed." Pansy raised an eyebrow at her. "He sent the Carrows here because they're his weakest links, and he thought we would fall in line easily. We've got to show him he's wrong." "Pansy's right," Neville said, a new fire in his eyes. "It's time for active resistance. Let's take the fight to them." Christmas was a fun affair at the Black House, a departure from the non-Hogwarts Christmases past for Harry. Christmas at the Dursleys had been a never-ending parade of watching Dudley furiously tear through his gifts, serving food to guests, and dodging attacks from Ripper and Erskine. Truly, what kind of sick fuck was Aunt Marge for naming all of her bulldogs after serial killers? He, Ron, Sirius, and Dumbledore were joined by several Weasleys, Remus, a heavily pregnant Tonks, and the Granger family. When Hermione and Ron stole away to chat with Harry for a few minutes, talk was of the Horcruxes, and how to destroy them. "Still no luck with a sword, huh?" Hermione asked. "No. The more I thought about it, the more I realized we can't just sit round here and wait for it to arrive. It isn't like there's going to be some amazing act of valor required between helping Sirius work on potions and libations, or watching Dumbledore knit. Don't get me wrong, Ron and I go out here and there to poke round, looking for Horcruxes or the sword, but there's no valor or courage needed for that either." "Where have you looked?" All kinds of places, the site of Riddle's old orphanage, a handful of wizarding villages like Upper Flatley, the Muggle street where Riddle bought his diary. We even went one day to Borgin and Burke's under the invisibility cloak, since he worked there once. We're just running out of ideas.
Helga Hufflepuff was from the part of Wales just outside of Cardiff. Have you checked for the cup there? Supposedly there's a few old castles you could investigate.
Why, are you looking for Helga Hufflepuff's cup? A curious voice interrupted them. The three of them sat in stunned silence for a moment, looking at the turquoise hair of Nymphadora Tonks. Foolishly, they had forgotten to cast a Muffliato charm before speaking. You don't have to tell me everything, but seeing as I'm the only Hufflepuff here, perhaps I can help. Hermione looked at the two boys, tilting her head at them. Why couldn't Tonks help? She was an Auror, after all. What better person to help? They didn't have to divulge everything. Harry was the first to speak. He gestured her into the other room, and Ron and Hermione followed. This time, they checked that the Muffliato was in place before speaking. We need to find the cup to help defeat Voldemort. It's tied to him, Harry said vaguely. Tonks's face went pale. Are you telling me he's made a Horcrux? All three sets of eyes nearly leaped from their heads. You know about Horcruxes? Ron asked in disbelief. I'm an Auror. I'm a dark wizard catcher. It's literally in my job description to know all the dark shit that wizards can get up to. Yes, I know about Horcruxes. Did he make one? Why the cup? Hermione drew in a deep breath. He did. He made more than one, in fact. And we've got to destroy it. The problem is, nobody knows where it is. Tonks looked hard at each of them. Finally, she turned to Harry. Let's talk about this soon, all right? We'll figure it out. Come up with a plan. Do you have any idea how to destroy them? We know of fiend fire and basilisk venom, but those are a bit unstable or hard to come by. Tonks nodded. Let me think on it. When January began melting into February, Harry called to say that he and Ron planned to go to Godric's Hollow, thinking that perhaps they would find the sword of Godric Gryffindor in the ruins of his childhood home.
Of course he would want to go there, Hermione moaned to Draco. It's where all of this began, at least for Harry. His parents died there. He almost died there.
So, perhaps you can end it there. What's the harm? Draco asked.
Don't you recall what my father said about the Dark Lord's name being taboo, and about his people keeping watch at certain locations for Harry? They have an approximation of where he is now. The only reason they can't walk in the front door is because Sirius's house is unplottable.
Right, so even though they say the name inside the house, Death Eaters can't get inside because of the Fidelius charm.
Exactly. But once they've left the safety of the house, all bets are off. They might slip up at any time. Add to this the fact that the Death Eaters know that there are a few places that Harry likely wants to visit.
You think they're walking into a trap? Why not tell Potter this?
I have, but he's convinced that something could be there.
Harry and Ron had been planning the trip to Godric's Hollow for days. They had an old map of the town, and were using it as their guide. Harry asked seemingly innocuous questions of Sirius. Where exactly was the site of the Potter house? Did Sirius think any neighbours were still around that knew them? Where were Harry's parents buried? The two wizards worked out a plan, of sorts. If anything went wrong, they would apparate separately to the forest where the Quidditch World Cup had been held to meet up, to avoid leading any Death Eaters or Snatchers back to 12 Grimmauld Place. To Hermione, it sounded like a half-thought-out plan, but they could not be dissuaded. It was less than half thought out. They had not planned on encountering the elderly witch on the street who lured them into her home with her mysterious air. They had not realized the witch was actually Nagini, Voldemort's snake in disguise, and they had not counted on Ron splinching himself when he landed at the campsite of the Quidditch World Cup. Hermione's texts went unanswered for hours after they were meant to return to Grimmauld Place. Finally, several hours after her last text, her mobile phone rang.
"Harry, what's happened?"
He told her everything that had transpired. "And now we're stuck here until Ron is better. My healing spells are shit, but thankfully I packed some dittany and some Muggle money. You remember the old man who ran the campsite? He had an extra tent that he loaned me. We're going to stay here a little while until Ron is better. I had to confund him. We were in a right state when we arrived."
"Are you sure it's safe?"
she asked worriedly. "No, I'm not," Harry said grimly. "But I don't have much of a choice. Ron can't be moved. It's bad, Hermione. The splinch, it went down to the bone. The snake had me pinned, and he fought it off, but then he got splinched. He's in a bad spot."
"Do you need me to come?"
Hermione asked seriously. "Don't be daft. You have enough to worry about there. I hear that Neville and his new girlfriend have been wreaking havoc every chance they get."
Hermione smiled in spite of the serious situation. "Who did you hear that from?" she asked.
"My girlfriend, who's also wreaking a good bit of havoc, at least according to her owls," Harry laughed.
Hermione chuckled. "Yes, she is." Pansy, Neville, and Ginny, along with the rest of Dumbledore's army, had been doing everything they could to destroy the Carrow's will to live. They set off dung bombs at every turn and spread temporary quicksand. They planted fireworks in the toilets, nifflers in the classroom, nosebleed nougat in with the Carrow's breakfasts. These things combined with an onslaught of hexes and jinxes were just scratching the surface. "Be careful. Don't use the name, whatever you do," she stressed. She told him a few protective enchantments to use, and bid them good luck.
"So they're camping?" Draco asked her, wrinkling his nose slightly in disgust.
"Yes," she answered.
Draco shuddered. "Better them than us."
She laughed a bit, but deep down she fretted. They were no closer to ending this thing than they'd been since the Ministry break-in. Something had to give.
Chapter 41. Connections, Convalescence, and Courage. February 1998. The middle of February found Richard Granger feeling a bit of relief, for the first time in several months, over this whole fixer-elixir nonsense. Quarter 4 earnings had finished strong, and Quarter 1 and 2 futures were looking even better. Additionally, he had found an excellent silent partner to bring into the organization. As the adults had gathered in the parlor after Christmas dinner, Sirius Black had passed around a curious concoction that was both delicious and calming. It had a smooth finish with no bitter aftertaste. "I hope you don't mind trying a bit of my own invention," Sirius had explained to the group. "Being holed up in here for years on end, I haven't had much to do besides reading and potion making. I've been seeing adverts for the fixer elixir in the Muggle market, and it made me think of a few ideas of my own." Everyone gave Sirius rave reviews, but it gave Richard an idea. He approached the man and asked to speak with him in private. "So you're telling me you want me to work on your fixer elixir, Voldemort's product?" Sirius asked in disbelief, after Richard told him about his idea for Sirius's part in the brand. "In name only. In reality, the whole campaign is entirely the brainchild of myself and a wizard, another reluctant Death Eater. All of the proceeds are going to support Muggle-born integration into the school. Voldemort doesn't know that, of course." "I should assume not," smirked Sirius. Then he sighed, his face growing grave once more. "I'm not sure I like this, Richard. This is a dangerous game you're playing." "It was the Order's idea," Richard grumbled. "When we suggested a distraction, we meant telling him that we had giants of our own, or thunderbirds at the ready, something like that," Sirius said uncertainly. "It has worked quite well," Richard said, in an effort to persuade him. "Voldemort is convinced that we will turn this into world domination, somehow." A slow, amused smile crept across Sirius's face. "Tell me, who is this other wizard, the reluctant Death Eater?" "His name is Quentin Jugson," Richard replied. "He's a half-blood. He went to a Muggle university. He doesn't want to be a Death Eater, but you know how that can be. Once you are one, it's impossible not to be one." Sirius nodded slowly. "I knew Jugson. He was a year younger than my brother, Regulus, a few years behind me. They were friends early in their Hogwarts years, but as my brother moved further towards the dark arts, they grew apart. I recall being surprised to learn that he had joined the Death Eaters. Will you consider coming on board? Expanding the brand? Perhaps take on a bit of the workload? Between my dental practice and attending meetings on both sides of this fight, I'm like a candle burning at both ends." Sirius finally nodded. The next day, Richard called Jugson and requested a meeting. When he explained exactly who was coming on board to handle product development and expansion, the wizard was silent for some time. "Cat got your tongue?" Richard asked. "I knew Sirius many years ago. I was surprised to hear that he'd joined up with the Death Eaters when the Potters were killed. He never struck me as the blood supremacy type, like his brother Regulus. He and Regulus were very different from each other. It was Regulus, was it not, who found you years ago, and brought you into the Dark Lord's fold?" Richard was uncertain which way to go with this, but he had now spent enough time with Jugson to know that the man was no typical Death Eater. "In actuality, I did not know Regulus." "But now you just happen to know Sirius Black. The same Sirius Black who never comes to meetings, and is never mentioned among the Death Eaters?" Jugson asked slowly. "I do know him," Richard answered evenly. There was a moment of silence between the two men. Then Jugson looked him in the eye and whispered, "When this is over, if this is over, and if you're still alive, will you tell them I wasn't entirely evil?" Richard's brow wrinkled in confusion. "What are you talking about? Who should I tell this?" "I told you. I knew the Black Brothers at Hogwarts. Regulus may have joined the ranks of Death Eater, but I knew that Sirius never did, never would, despite what the papers said. So, when the time comes, can you let them know?" "Who?" "The Order. That's who you're really working for, isn't it?" Jugson asked softly. "I'm afraid I don't—" "Richard, I know the score here. I'm probably not going to make it out of this alive, and even if by some miracle I do, I am branded for life." He gestured to his left arm. "When history is written about this time, I'm going to be remembered as being on the wrong side. But perhaps you can let them know I didn't want this. I didn't want to be evil." Richard sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, I'll make sure they know." By close to the end of February, Ron was mostly healed from his splinching. However, he'd had difficulty adjusting to living in a tent. Whilst the black house had not been particularly hospitable, it at least had been warm, with soft bedding and 3 hot meals a day. Life in the tent was more primitive. They were able to scrounge a bit of food, either on their own or with creatures' help, but their warming charms faded after a few hours, and an old shoe transfigured into a bed still felt and smelt a bit like an old shoe. To make matters worse for both of them, they were taking it in turns to wear Slytherin's locket, afraid of leaving it unprotected in the tent. It was Harry's night to wear the locket, and he was unable to sleep. The locket gave him vivid, horrifying dreams that he knew were probably seated in reality. Like several nights before now, he awoke and went to stand in the doorway of the tent, looking out. It was then that the doe appeared. Awash in silvery light, the beautiful creature came to the edge of their wards, stomping her feet lightly in greeting. Harry took one look at her and knew that she meant no harm. When she turned and cantered away, he could not help but follow. When she stopped and lowered her head as though to drink from the small pool of water, he approached slowly. Her ethereal light bathed the pool in brightness, and he could just make out a glint of silver and red. Peering down into the pool, he knew precisely what it was he was seeing, although its presence made no sense here. The doe faded from existence as quickly and as easily as it had arrived. He plunged his hand into the pool, but the sword of Gryffindor was far too deep to reach. He looked around, shivering. It was too cold for a swim. The light snow on the ground had been here since they'd arrived, and the packed earth was nearly frozen solid. "Accio sword," he said through chattering teeth, but the sword did not move. He had not expected it to. He had no alternative. This, then, was the act of courage needed to claim the prize. He quickly stripped down to his pants, and before he could lose his nerve, dove in. Down he swam as quickly as possible, before his limbs seized with cold. His frigid fingers closed around the hilt and pulled the sword free easily. But something was wrong. When he tried to rise to the surface, something pulled him back. It was as though a dozen Grindylows had him round the neck, but he could see nothing in the murky light of his wand above the pool. His last thought, as he lost consciousness, was that, somehow, this didn't feel particularly valorous. When he awoke, he was surprised to be breathing air and not nearly frozen water. "Are you mental?" Ron's voice asked from next to him. "What the fuck were you thinking? Going in there with that thing on?" "The sword," Harry managed to croak. "It's still in the pool." "You mean this sword, mate?" Ron held up the glittering sword of Gryffindor. "Yeah, you wouldn't let go of it, but you couldn't swim with it either, so somehow I managed to get both of you to the surface. Do me a favour and don't let this quest kill you before you-know-who gets his chance." Despite his lack of feeling in his extremities, Harry could not help but giggle. "You know what this means, Ron?" At the other wizard's questioning look, he said, "It was your act of valor, not mine, that took place down there. That means the sword is yours to use, you know." Even though the temperature was far below comfortable, Ron blushed. "Bit of an overstatement, don't you think?" "No, Ron, listen, mate. The locket affects you differently than it does me. I mean, I know it just tried to drown me, but when you wear it..." Ron looked down, ashamed. "Yeah, I know. Bit of an asshole when I wear it. I don't know. Makes me think all kinds of thoughts. Not good ones. I realise I'm not the most well-adjusted, confident bloke. It kind of comes with the territory, considering my brothers and all. Dragon tamers and curse breakers and ministry officials and business owners. And then me. Add to that my best friend's nickname is literally the Chosen One. Harry interrupted. I didn't choose that, you know. Ron laughed. I know, Harry, but it's difficult sometimes, you know? Being only me. I know, Ron, Harry said quietly. That's why this needs to be only you. 10 minutes later, the locket, now cleaved in two, and the sword of Gryffindor packed safely away in a bag of important items. The two Gryffindors apparated back to the Black House at last. Harry had been right. They had needed to leave the comfort of the house in order to find that valor within themselves. But after several weeks away, they were happy to be back indoors again. February 26th, 1998. Tonks was bored. Her pregnancy had been going well, right up until the 9th month, when everything seemed to go to hell in a handbasket all at once. Her healer at St. Mungo's insisted that this was perfectly normal in magical pregnancies. The baby was becoming more aware of his or her surroundings, and was possibly sparking small doses of accidental magic. The solution was an abundance of caution, meaning bed rest, which Tonks found incredibly tedious. As Remus was still working for both MI6 and the Order, she had returned to her mother's house, only to be reminded of why she no longer lived with her mother. Andromeda Tonks was well-meaning, but smothering. She was constantly in the room to fluff pillows or offer food and drinks. She'd brought in books and an unreal number of magazines, and even a Muggle television. After 3 days of watching Muggle celebrity gossip, soap operas, and game shows, Tonks could feel her brain falling apart. It didn't help that every other advert break featured the catchy jingle of the Fixer Elixir advert. Even after turning it off, she could still hear that blasted song. If you need a pick-me-up, need it faster and quicker, just pick up a bottle of the Fixer Elixir. She dozed off, dreaming about blasting a bottle of Fixer Elixir with an incendio hex. She woke up with a little smile on her face. But the dream had jogged loose in her mind dormant thoughts about cups and fires. She had promised Harry, Ron, and Hermione 2 months ago that she would look more into the process for destroying Horcruxes. She'd also agreed to mull over the mystery of Hufflepuff's cup. She felt a bit guilty, having done very little of either. Between having to maintain a facade of normalcy with the Auror Department, which had been taken over with every other department of the Ministry by Voldemort, her work with the Order, her assignments with MI6, and her new husband and her pregnancy, the weeks had slipped away without her realizing it. That wouldn't do at all, she resolved. She summoned several arcane work manuals and set to reading. Several hours later she felt mildly reassured that, if the time came that she needed to create fiend fire, she could control it, as long as she had competent help. She turned her thoughts to the cup. Where could it be? Harry had not revealed what other objects had been turned into Horcruxes, nor where the objects had been located. She picked up her mobile phone. "Harry, it's Tonks. Need to talk with you. Can I call?" A reply came 5 minutes later. "Yes, now is a good time." 10 minutes later, Harry was pacing frantically in the room he shared with Ron, when his ginger roommate returned from the kitchen, where he'd gone for a snack. "What's wrong?" Ron asked, his defenses immediately alert. "Tonks. Is the baby okay?" "Yes," Harry answered. "The baby's fine. At least I'm pretty sure. She called about the cup. She wants to know about the others. Should we tell her, do you reckon?" Harry looked his friend in the eyes. "I think we need to. I just got off the phone with her. We should pay her a visit." Ron looked down mournfully at the giant sandwich he had just made himself. "Do you think I could—" "Leave it, mate." Harry apparated the pair of them to a country lane in a shaded wood. "Where are we?" Ron asked, looking around. There was no house in sight. Ron took the mobile from his pocket. Sorry, look at this message. Ron focused on the tiny screen. The Tonks residence is at 208 Broomhall Road, Surrey. She's secret keeper? Ron whispered, and Harry nodded. There was a popping sound nearby, and they turned as a grey blur pushed itself between two trees, forming slowly into a house. Once inside, Ron was pleased to learn that Andromeda Tonks had all the makings for a delicious sandwich, and was simply aching for someone to dote upon, considering her daughter was having none of it. An hour later, Tonks had gone from the lethargy of endless bed rest to the excitement of knowing that an adventure was on the horizon. Harry had told her where the locket, ring, and diaries had been kept during Voldemort's time in hiding. Then he had discussed all the places that they'd been, looking for the cup and whatever objects of Rowena Ravenclaw's he could discover. She knew he hadn't told her everything about the Horcruxes. It would be foolish to do so, she assured him. Dangerous information such as that should be compartmentalized, so that if one person were captured and tortured for knowledge, all of the information wasn't lost. But she had enough of the big picture to come up with a few theories. "Let me think on all of this," she told the two wizards. "I must tell you, in my current state, I'm somewhat useless as far as retrieving these objects, but I will at least try to think of where they could be." Harry nodded. "Thanks for your help, and good luck with the delivery. How long, do you think, until the baby comes?" "No more than a few weeks," Tonks said, "and I'm beyond ready. He's been sitting on my bladder for about a month now." "Is going to be a boy?" Ron asked, looking a bit disappointed. "Oh, that will be nice, I suppose. Of course, my family has plenty of them." Tonks laughed as the two young wizards departed. Over the next several days, Tonks considered everything she had heard. The locket had been sealed in a cave, a place that had meant something important to Voldemort. According to Harry, it had been a symbol of his power over others, particularly Muggles. The ring had been hidden away in his ancestral home, a tie into his family history, his connection with Salazar Slytherin. But the diary was something else entirely. It had been left in the care of Lucius Malfoy, one of Voldemort's most loyal servants. Would Voldemort have trusted more than one Horcrux to a devoted follower? Tonks picked up her mobile and scrolled through her contacts. She quickly tapped out a message. "R, it's Tonks. Need to talk to you. Call when you can." 15 minutes later, the mobile rang. "Hiya, Tonks. How can I help?" Richard asked. "Sorry to bother you, Richard. You've told us everyone in you-know-who's inner circle, but who, specifically, are his closest people?" Richard considered. "I think Lucius is pretty high up there. Dolohov, Yaxley, probably. But I get the sense that he's always thought of Bellatrix as one of his closest. Certainly she's one of his most eager." Tonks thanked him, and lay back in bed to think. Lucius was entrusted with one of these Horcruxes, and he hadn't even been Voldemort's closest henchman. Would he have given Bellatrix this same honour? Undoubtedly so. "If I were Bellatrix, where would I hide a cup? Or a tiara?" Tonks asked herself. But try as she might, she wasn't sure she could get into the witch's head, and there would be no room for error. She would likely only get one shot at retrieving the Horcrux. If she couldn't ask her lovely Aunt Bellatrix herself, she'd have to do the next best thing. Talk to Bellatrix's sister. She checked the calendar. It was Wednesday. She was in luck. Wednesday was Andromeda's night where she met Tonks's father at the safe house in Bristol. There would be a small window of time to plan. She picked up her mobile once more. Narcissa, are you busy this evening? Any chance you can collect Linda and come round Route 7? The angels are due for a reunion. Chapter 42. Depository and Disclosure. The middle of March, 1998. Narcissa and Linda settled themselves with their take-out containers of curry on the small settee next to Tonks's bed.
"So, what's all this about, Nymphadora?"
Narcissa asked, spearing a piece of buttered chicken with her fork. Tonks tore herself away from salivating over the remainder of her meal of Rogan Josh. "The upshot of it is this," she began. "There are certain objects that you-know-who has hidden that are important to his cause. The Order needs to find them and destroy them. I believe he may have given one of these objects to Bellatrix many years ago. Of the three of us, you know her best, Aunt Narcissa. Where would she have hidden such an object?"
Narcissa put down her fork, lost in thought. "I don't believe she has it with her. Bellatrix is too paranoid. If this is something important to her Dark Lord, it would be kept somewhere under lock and key. She is rather nomadic these days. Many days she's at Malfoy Manor, although occasionally she remembers her husband and goes to Maison Lestrange."
"Do you think it could be there?" asked Linda.
"I don't believe so. Bellatrix has a lot of disdain for Rodolphus and his brother. She wouldn't entrust either of them with such an object."
Narcissa tore a piece of naan bread in half, and daintily nibbled a bit of it, swallowing before speaking again.
"No, for centuries, families like the Blacks and the Lestranges only trust one place more than any other for security."
Narcissa's eyes met her niece's, and they said together, "Gringotts." "That's the bank in Diagon Alley, yes?" "Are you proposing we rob a bank?" Linda asked, eyebrows raised in surprise.
"I wasn't,"
said Narcissa with wide eyes. "I was," Tonks said, with a spark in her voice. After another Wednesday night strategy meeting, their plan was coming together, and not a moment too soon. The time for Tonks to deliver was fast approaching, and Linda was overjoyed the next Monday to receive a message informing her that baby Edward Remus Lupin had been born healthy over the weekend. Narcissa said the little family was doing quite well, and that they could go and see her and the baby in mid-April, once they had settled into a bit of a routine and were ready for visitors. April 15th, 1998. Voldemort was growing anxious, which made Richard nervous. The man was barely clinging to the edge of reason as it was, and anxiety only ramped up his manic state. He'd sent wizards out on more missions in the last couple of weeks than ever before, searching for either Muggle-borns or Harry Potter. Richard knew that nearly all Muggle-borns, with the notable exception of Hermione, had either fled the country or were in safe houses, and Potter was hidden away behind the unplottability of the Black House, but it still made him fearful. Everyone's exhaustion was evident. Jugson looked as though he hadn't slept properly in many days, and Lucius's eye twitched uncontrollably. Remarkably, Bellatrix looked much the same as she always did, but seeing as she was always looking as though she were one breath away from spiraling into the abyss, this shouldn't have been very surprising. Worse, the Dark Lord was starting to insinuate that the time was right for Fixer Elixir to turn from innocuous energy drink brand that people trusted to instrument of mass murder. The thought of Voldemort somehow figuring out how to corrupt the supply chain of the drink and poison it kept Richard awake at night. For at least the 1000th time, he wondered why he had ever started this infernal mess. The meeting was wrapping up. Richard stood with the others and prepared to leave, but was stopped by the high, cold voice of Voldemort.
"Richard, I wish to speak to you alone."
His stomach was a cold pit of fear, but he turned back, facing the red-eyed man. Voldemort waited until they were alone to speak.
"I fear we are losing our grip on Wizarding Society. There are underground newspapers publishing untruths about me, renegade groups plotting against me. I have not mentioned it in the meetings with everyone, but the Carrows are facing a lot of resistance at the school. I know that Snape and young Malfoy and your daughter are helping them, but it doesn't seem to be enough."
Richard only nodded, uncertain where Voldemort was going with this.
"I envision a time in the near future when all of us will be called to fight for the betterment of Wizarding Society. I'm glad to know that I can count on the support of you and your daughter. I would hate to think of what would happen to your dear Linda should we fail."
Richard nodded mutely, but inside he was frantic with fear. Never in all their meetings had the man intimated that he would go after Linda if Richard did not succeed. "I understand, cousin," he murmured. Voldemort disapparated, leaving Richard standing alone, forcing his breathing to normalize before he met Lucius to return to his Hampstead home. Back at home in his living room, Richard found the house empty. His nerves were jittery, and to reassure himself that he was alone, he went from room to room, flicking on the lights. When he reached the basement, he entered his private room, retrieving the gun with the silver bullets and holstering it in a shoulder holster. He had expected Linda to be home from yoga by now. Ordinarily at this hour, his wife was already showered and in her pajamas for the night. His fear for her safety only increased as the minutes ticked by and the messages to her mobile went unanswered. He turned off the lights and sat on the sofa to wait. Finally, at 15 minutes after 9, the front door opened quietly. Linda crept by the door of the living room on her way to the staircase, shoes held in hand. "Lindy Hop?" Richard called quietly, flicking on the lights. "Where were you?"
"Oh, Richard, you gave me such a fright. Why were you sitting here in the dark, love?"
Linda asked him. He smiled but didn't answer.
"Yoga tonight?" Yes," she answered. "You left your yoga mat at home," Richard said quietly, gesturing to the mat near the living room door. "Ah, yes."
Linda turned and placed her shoes near the front door, then rose to look him in the eye.
"You had tennis tonight, did you not? With Robert?"
He hesitated only for a moment before saying,
"I did."
"Your tennis racket has been in the boot of the car for the last fortnight. I noticed a while back that there was a large hole in it, and I've been meaning to take it to get it restrung." Richard was silent. "So, where have you really been going, Richard?" Linda asked.
"I asked you first, darling," he hedged.
"I was in Cardiff, helping your mother's cousin repair that chicken coop." Richard sucked in a shallow breath. He looked away swiftly, his mind working through every possible equation, and coming up with only one answer. She knew. Possibly she had always known. And what's more, apparently she herself was involved in some way.
"You know about me? What I
do?" he asked quietly.
"Yes, Richard," she said with a small smile.
"How long have you known?"
"How long have we been married?" she countered.
"I asked your mother, years ago, about the health of her cousin. Turns out your mother doesn't have any cousins in Cardiff. It didn't take long to put it all together. Random mobile phones in the nightstand. You needing to go out of town on late notice. There were times you said you were going to organize the basement, but I would go down and couldn't find you anywhere. And then you would come back upstairs as though nothing were wrong. I knew you weren't seeing anyone, but that wasn't like you. I know you said you received a stipend for injuries from your years in service, but the money in the accounts each month, it seemed like more than just a disability stipend. And with your background, it just fit." He sighed. "Linda, I never intended to keep you in the dark. I only wanted to keep you safe," Richard said gently. "It was one thing when it was just the regular world, but once I got sucked into this whole wizarding thing with you-know-who—"
"I know, darling. I had to accept that knowledge a long time ago. There are parts of your life that you cannot talk about. But as long as you kept returning to us, I knew you were safe."
"So, how long have you been involved in all of this? What have you been doing?"
"Only since last September. I've been meeting with Tonks and Narcissa on occasion."
Richard smiled to himself. "I knew you hated bowling." Linda laughed. "And I knew that Robert moved to Edinburgh years ago. I'm guessing you've been involved in all of this a lot longer. You must be the source of the insider information that Tonks has mentioned on occasion. How did it start, by the way? I assume Lucius didn't just ask you to join the Death Eaters and you agreed." "No, if you can believe it. It was this blasted tattoo," he chuckled, gesturing to his arm. "Evidently, it looks enough like his that he assumed I was one of them all this time."
Richard crossed to her and took her arms, putting them around his waist and running his own hands from her shoulders to her back. He lowered his lips to hers, giving her a long kiss. He was glad, now, to finally have no secrets between them.
"It's been a long night. I'm tired, but we have so much to discuss. Let's go upstairs and get ready for bed, love."
He smiled against her forehead. Once in their bedroom, she looked up as he removed his jacket, startling in surprise when she noticed the holster underneath.
"You don't wear that all the time," she said. "What happened tonight?" "Nothing," he said, "and nothing will happen to you. You're with me now."
She crossed to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, then looked up at him with a lazy smile.
Well, you are the man with the golden gun," she quipped.
He chuckled softly, hugging her to him. Her hands came up his back and brushed against the muzzle of the gun. She frowned.
"Richard,"
Linda said, pulling away from him a bit.
"take this thing off."
She pushed lightly at the holster around his shoulders. He shrugged first one muscular arm, then the other one free from the brown leather of the holster. Unsnapping the latch, securing the gun, he turned away from her, clicking the gun to drop the magazine from it. Next, he racked the gun and checked the chamber, ensuring that it was not loaded. Then he carefully placed the gun and magazine down on the dresser and turned back to her, free from the bonds of the leather holster. She smiled languidly up at him, moving to the bed and pulling down the duvet and the sheet.
"There will be time to talk tomorrow. We're both tired. Come on, let's get some rest."
They climbed into bed. Gently, he laid one arm across his wife's stomach, pulling her against him. He pulled up the coverlet back over the two of them to ward off the cold intrusion of air around their warm bodies.
"Here, love," he said, kissing her hair and tucking the coverlet in around her knees. "Let's go undercover together." She laughed. "I always knew I had a spy who loved me." He smiled against her neck. His wife was right. Linda did have a spy who loved her so very much. Over the next couple of weeks, they talked nightly, updating each other on what they knew, offering ideas and suggestions to each other. They were getting ready to defend their right to exist as Muggles, ready to fight for their daughter and everyone like her, ready to defeat the Dark Lord once and for all.
Chapter 43. Stunts and Swindles. May 1st, 1998. It was happening today. Whatever it was, Harry knew. Tonks had texted him the previous evening, letting him know that she thought she knew where one of them was, and she was working on a plan to destroy it. She would let him know if they had been successful. Tonks met Narcissa and Linda in the Granger's living room at 6 in the morning. Though Tonks was fully recovered from baby Teddy's birth, she was leaving him for the first time in the care of someone else, and she was understandably nervous. The fact that he was with her mother was a comfort, at least. She had coordinated with Kingsley to ensure that his contacts with magical law enforcement were suitably distracted today, so as not to interfere with what they had to do in Diagon Alley. Additionally, she'd gotten in touch with Bill Weasley. As a curse-breaker, Bill's knowledge had been invaluable in preparing for what was to come inside Gringotts. Linda stepped out of the ground-floor guest room with uncertainty. "Are you sure this is right? Would she really wear a cloak and long sleeves? It's extraordinarily warm." Narcissa spoke up.
"Yes, ever since she returned from Azkaban, she's been inordinately cold. I suppose one is never truly warm there," she said thoughtfully.
"No, I don't think it's ever warm there. I've visited for work. It's quite miserable."
Tonks agreed.
"Goodness, the most exciting places I visit for work is the biannual dentist convention in Brighton," Linda said. 300 of the most boring individuals in Britain, all coming together to talk about the importance of flossing and the merits or the perils of fluoride."
Narcissa and Tonks laughed. Tonks turned to the mirror near the front door.
"All right, Aunt Narcissa, let's get my disguise ready."
Tonks began to adjust the length and colour of her hair and the shape of her face to match Narcissa's instructions. Once she was a nearly perfect approximation of Rodolphus Lestrange, Tonks removed a small vial from her waistcoat.
"I'll warn you, Linda, this tastes like ice warmed over. Prepare yourself," Tonks said.
Linda, having never tasted ice warmed over, didn't know what to expect, but at the first gulp she had to agree with Tonks's assessment. She grimaced and forced herself not to retch. She felt her hair lengthen and thicken, growing heavier. Her eyes became more lidded, her lips thinner. She turned to look in the mirror and found the face of Bellatrix Lestrange looking back at her. In spite of everything she had seen over the course of the last 6 years as part of the wizarding world, this was by far the strangest, she thought.
"Right, let's go.
Richard will be awake any minute," she said to the others. The goblins at Gringotts Bank were far more accommodating to Narcissa, Rodolphus, and Bellatrix than they had ever been to the Grangers in all their years of exchanging Muggle money for galleons at the start of the school year, Linda noticed wryly. The ride through the vaults of Gringotts was a particular treat for her, one familiar to Narcissa and, to a lesser extent, Tonks. But it was a ride that had never been taken by a Muggle before. Likewise, the Lestrange vault was filled with all manner of beautiful, priceless items. To Linda, it looked like something from a film, all gleaming and gold, dripping with jewels. Narcissa was unfazed, likely because this paled in comparison to her own vault, Linda mused.
So,
Narcissa said, looking around,
we think we're looking for a cup or a tiara?
Linda frowned. She could count at least 12 tiaras without even turning her head, and the walls were lined with all manner of cups, goblets, plates, and bowls. The tiara will likely have a sapphire in the front, and the cup will have a small badger on it. Tonks picked up a nearby cup with an elk on it. No, not... But her words were cut off by her shock. The cup she had picked up suddenly glowed orange with heat, burning her hand. What's more, the little vessel began to duplicate itself, and more elk cups erupted from the original. "Impostors!" cried the goblin who had accompanied them. "Imperio!" said Tonks forcefully. She had known this was a possibility, and was ready, and had prepared her team. "That won't work in here, impostor!" the goblin shouted. From the look on Tonks's face, Linda could tell she had not expected this. If magic could not work in this vault, did they have any chance of succeeding? Thankfully, the temporary loss of her magic had not dulled the aura's reflexes. Tonks tackled the goblin to the ground, putting a knee in his back and trussing up his hands with a strip of cloth, torn from the cloak she wore. Likewise, Narcissa tore a bunch of fabric from her own cloak, to tie around the goblin's mouth, and stop him from calling for assistance. When the goblin was subdued, Tonks reached in her bag for the essence of dittany, and began applying it to her fingers. "All right. Avoid touching anything, if you can help it," Tonks said, as her wrist grazed a pewter vase on a nearby shelf. The multiplying vases clanged to the ground at her feet. "Sorry." Narcissa spotted a tiara with a large sapphire in the center, but had to pick it up to examine it. It wasn't the diadem of Ravenclaw, and the copious copies that flew from it showered Narcissa's feet. She took the dittany from Tonks and spread it on her own fingers gratefully. "The dittany will work less and less, the more injuries we receive," Tonks said. "We have to be judicious about what we touch."
"Girls, what about this?"
Linda asked, pointing. On a top shelf in the corner of the room sat a small, unassuming golden cup. It was set apart from the other goblets and the cups in the room, and Tonks instantly recognized it from the painting of Helga Hufflepuff in their common room. "That's it!" Tonks cried. "Accio cup!" The cup did not budge. Tonks had expected this as well, but had to try. "Can you levitate me up there?" Linda asked Tonks. This was attempted and failed. "Right. Girls, we're about to attempt something that I haven't done since my days in cheer club at the U of Portsmouth." Linda blew out a breath, feeling Bellatrix's coarse, dark hair resettle on her forehead. "So, first, the two of you will face each other and get in a lunge position. We'll start with a thigh stand." 15 minutes later, after much trial and error on the three women's parts, Tonks and Narcissa had managed to get Linda to stand on Narcissa's shoulders without touching too many more items in the vault. Linda had torn most of the ridiculous skirt away to allow herself to move more freely. Hopefully, once they left the vault, Narcissa or Tonks could transfigure it into something more reasonable. Tonks was the first to spot a problem, as she spotted her Muggle friend. "Linda, not to doubt you or anything, but, how are you going to get down?" "Let me worry on it," Linda said through gritted teeth as she further engaged her core to stand steady on the quaking Narcissa's shoulders. "Just a bit more left, Sissa. There, I've got it." "Right, toss it down to me before it burns you too badly," Tonks called to her, holding her hands out to catch. It's not burning me," Linda said in confusion, as she held the cup carefully. "Why isn't it burning me?"
"Never mind that right now. When are you getting down?
An anguished Narcissa asked from below her.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Right. Give me your hands.
Linda reached down for Narcissa's hands, but Narcissa did not move.
I can't,
Narcissa whispered fearfully. Linda nodded, gathering her courage. Right. Hold very still, then. I'm going to push off of you.
You're going to what?
Narcissa asked, but the question was answered almost immediately, as Linda bent her knees and jumped, tucking and rolling as she hit the ground, then jumping to her feet. It was unpracticed, and she was no longer in the shape she'd been in at 19, but for someone that hadn't done anything like that in well over 20 years, she'd managed the landing well. Tonks and Narcissa stood slack-jawed.
Well, fuck, that was amazing,
Tonks finally said. We should go. I might not be able to move in about 10 minutes, Linda said urgently. Narcissa was confused.
But how are you still holding that cup? Everything in the room has a flagrante and a Geminio curse on it.
Perhaps it's just the cup,
Tonks said, gripping one handle of the cup. Immediately, the young witch's hand was singed, and more Hufflepuff cups flowed from the original. She let go quickly. On a whim, Linda touched the pewter vase that Tonks had touched earlier. Nothing happened. The three women looked at each other in confusion, but it was the rapidly bouncing goblin that broke the silence with his grunting, clearly wishing to speak. Narcissa leaned down and lowered the piece of fabric from the goblin's mouth.
This woman, disguised as Bellatrix Lestrange, is a Muggle, obviously,
the goblin said smugly, as though this explained everything.
What does that have to do with anything?
Tonks asked.
This woman, the goblin looked pointedly at Narcissa, is a witch, but not a Lestrange. You look like a Lestrange, but your own magical identity is still your own. This woman has no magical signature of her own, and so the vault only recognizes the physical touch of its owner, Mrs. Lestrange.
Wow, said Tonks. Doesn't seem very secure in retrospect, does it?
It does not,
the goblin agreed reluctantly. Narcissa smiled kindly at him.
You've been quite helpful to us today, Lagnold. Don't worry, we'll send an anonymous owl to the bank next week to make sure they know you're in here.
We're leaving him in here?
Linda asked in horror.
He'll sound the alarm. We can't take any chances,
Narcissa said reasonably.
Come, it's time to go.
They had the goblin put his hand against the door to open it, but realized almost instantly that there was a problem. A loud klaxon alarm was sounding in the cavernous bank. In the distance they could make out loud voices yelling about intruders. Lagnold smiled nastily.
Sounds like it's time to stay.
Linda put a hand in her pocket, turning menacingly towards the goblin. I don't think so. Lagnold, was it? Do you know what a Muggle gun does? Because I just so happen to have one here in my pocket, and it's pointed at your head. Indeed, from the skirts of her ripped dress, one could make out the barrel of a gun.
Here's what you're going to do, Lagnold. We're going to pretend that we are innocent victims here, just trying to leave. You're going to take us back to the bank lobby and escort us out the front door and into the street. We'll disapparate and let you go. But one false move and... She drew a line across her throat. No more Lagnold.
And so they did. Once out of the vault, Tonks quickly repaired Linda's skirt, and Linda held the cup securely inside her other pocket. Lagnold haughtily informed the other goblins they passed that he was escorting Mrs. Malfoy and the Lestranges out of danger, and they reached the street without incident. Tonks stood between the other two women and turned on the spot with them, landing in the living room of the home she shared with Remus.
Linda, that was amazing! I'm so glad you thought to bring a gun, Tonks exclaimed, as the three of them breathed a sigh of relief.
Linda sheepishly removed her hand from her pocket, where her middle and index finger still formed the gun barrel shape. "Me too!" Thank you for listening to The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great78. If you enjoyed this and would like to listen to more, please subscribe to me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts at Silver and Copper, or search Great78 on Archive of Our Own.